Bible, I have to say this because I think this is one of the things that maybe unconsciously we don't really think about. The people in the Bible were people. Okay? In other words, they're not like a character, they're not Oliver Twist, right? They're not a character in a novel. They're not a fictional character. Real people who lived in real time, had real relationships, and they had real personalities. So these are flesh and blood people, just like us. Which means they had quirks, right? Which means they had weaknesses, which means they had strengths, which means they had marriage issues and parenting issues and all the kind of things that we still have today. It means they were funny. We were talking about this at dinner last night, how hilarious the people in the Bible are. You know why they're hilarious? Because they're people. Just like all of us. I mean, we laugh at people all the time, right? Maybe because they do something funny, maybe because they do something dumb. Whatever it is, people do funny things. They say funny things. Same way with people in the Bible. So when you're reading through the biblical story, don't think that you have to sit there, very somber, very serious. This is the Bible, people. There's nothing funny here. This is sacred stuff. No, there's hardly anything that happens in the narratives of the Scriptures which doesn't have some sort of humor attached to it. Even God laughs. Of course it's funny. They're people. Now, when you encounter these people with all their weaknesses and strengths and problems and whatnot, another thing you find them doing are being used by God in sometimes really shocking ways, surprising ways, backward sorts of ways to accomplish what God wants to be accomplished. Or sometimes He will put them in a specific office or position to do something that God wants them to do, usually for the broader nation of Israel. So we have kings, we have prophets, we have warriors, we have shepherds, we have all kinds of folks doing all kinds of things in the Old Testament. Now here's my encouragement to you. As you're reading through these narratives, kind of look at the people, and their personalities and all that stuff we were just talking about, but also ask yourself, okay, what's God doing with this person and through this person? Okay, what's God doing? And then how is this thing that He's doing, what name can I put to that? Is He providing victory for His people through this person? Is He providing kind of a ritual cleansing? Maybe it's a priest. Is He providing that for His people through this person? Is He leading His people through this person? What is He doing through this person? Put a name on that. Leadership, redemption, cleansing, whatever it might be. And then kind of step back from that and say, do I discern a pattern of God doing this with a lot of other people in the Old Testament? So a lot of kings, right? A lot of priests, right? A lot of warriors. A lot of people doing these sorts of things God is doing through them for His people. And you put names to this. And then take a step back from that and say, okay, I'm seeing this pattern. I'm seeing what God is doing. Now, this is all going somewhere, right? Just like, to use the movie or the book analogy I used earlier, when you start chapter 1, you know this story is going to change, and it's going to lead you to the climax, right? Books do that. Movies, narratives do that. If you tell a story, you'll be like, you won't believe what happened to me yesterday. The minute you say that, someone expects you to tell them something that is a story that culminates in whatever happened. That's the way narratives work. The whole biblical narrative is like that. The minute you open up Genesis, you know something is going to come. Something is on the horizon. You don't know when it's going to happen, but it's coming. There's going to be a culmination to this story. And along the way, you're going to learn about how God likes to use people to do things for His people. There's a discernible pattern that God likes to establish, with names attached to what God is doing through these patterns. And then all of this is leading to what Christ does. So when you get to the New Testament, everything's prepared for you. Everything that Jesus does has in some way, and maybe it's in a shadowy way, but in some way it's been prepared for you through the pages of the Old Testament. That He's a priest? Well, yeah, you've got all the priestly stuff going on, and you have this weird priest named Melchizedek back in Genesis 14. It's all been prepared for you. Is He a king? Well, yeah. Well, you have David, or Saul and David, and all these other kings preparing you for this. Is he rescuing his people? Yeah, a lot of rescuing going on in the Old Testament. Is he a judge? Yeah, you got that going on too. So my point is that when you're reading the Old Testament, you sometimes have to kind of step back from it and say, okay, what's God doing in this story, in this person? How does it connect to this whole web of other connections that is going to lead me then to Christ? Because one of the beautiful things about the Bible, to use this web analogy, is that if you have a spider web, which are just magnificent creations, right? If you think of the whole scriptures as a kind of a spider web, if you touch a spider web over here, it's going to reverberate all through, right? If you touch it over here, it's going to reverberate all through. Bible's the same way. You touch Revelation 4, the vibration goes all the way back to Psalm 4 or to Genesis 3, whatever it might be. You touch Genesis 4, it reverberates through the Psalms and Isaiah and all the way to Revelation. That's one of the beautiful things about the scriptures that make them an exciting journey. It doesn't matter where you touch the Bible, it's going to connect with all the rest of the scriptures. It's like a hyperlink to text. You click on this, it takes you here. There's more links to click on. They take you there. The reason it is that way is because you have a multitude of human authors, right? But you have one divine author who provides the cohesion to the entire narrative. So the Spirit is the co-author of all of these books. And so he has designed them in such a way that they are this interconnected web of revelation to us. That's why we can read Genesis in light of Revelation. You can read Exodus in light of Romans, or you can read Psalms in light of Galatians. Whatever it is, they're all by the same author, and so they have this interconnectedness. So as you're reading through, as you're touching the web of the Old Testament, especially having to do with people, you're going to begin to see how this reverberates to the rest of the Scriptures. Let me give you some examples. This kind of gets to thinking about this. We'll start with something the rabbis like to say. This is later on, centuries after the New Testament, but when rabbis were trying to give expression to something they saw in the Old Testament, they came up with this kind of catchphrase, Maaseh Avot Simon Lavanim, which means the deeds of the fathers are a sign for the sons. And what they meant by that is that what the patriarchs especially did, the deeds of the fathers, these were a sign for those who were to come after them. Kind of like they were blazing a trail that others would follow. And the example they always went to was Genesis 12. This is when we're introduced to Abraham. Abram at the time. I'll just call him Abraham, but he's Abram and Sarai, Abraham and Sarah. You start out with Genesis 12. God says to Abraham, Lech lekah, which in Hebrew means basically, get yourself going. He's going to leave everything behind. His father's house, his country, everything. He's going to get going. Did you ever notice, by the way, that he doesn't follow that command? Who does he bring with him? He brings Lot with him, which I always thought was kind of funny. He doesn't really leave everything behind. He brings his nephew with him. But anyway, that's Abraham. He gets going. He goes to the place. He doesn't know where he's going, but he gets going. And they get there. They get to the promised land. And they build some altars, all this stuff. Before they get there, before you know it, there's a famine, right? So you got a famine. What are you going to do in the ancient world when there's a famine? You go to the breadbasket of that region. Egypt. The Romans nicknamed Egypt the breadbasket because that's where they got all their food from. Because of the flooding of the Nile, you always had food there. So you go to Egypt. So Abraham and Sarah go to Egypt. While they're there, before they get there, Abraham says to his wife, you know, you're really hot. Kind of worried about what might happen. So let's make a deal. Why don't you just tell everybody? I mean, it's only half a lie. You are my half-sister. Y'all did know that about Abraham and Sarah, right? One of those weird biblical marriages, half-brother, half-sister. Anyway, why don't you just tell everybody you're my sister? Make everything easier. So she does. And, of course, when they get there, she ends up in Pharaoh's harem, Pharaoh's house. Now, you're following through this story and thinking, okay, what's going on here? You got a famine. Abraham and Sarah end up in Egypt. Now Now Sarah's taken, and then God, what does God start to do to Pharaoh's house? He starts sending plagues on Pharaoh's house. He plagues Pharaoh's house. Now before all this is going on, Abraham is getting rich. Pharaoh's giving him all this stuff because of his sister. Oh, the Bible is so funny. Then God plagues Pharaoh's house. Pharaoh finds out what's going on, and he says, "You get out of here." And so they leave. Rich from Egypt, right? Okay, those are the basics of the story. Sound familiar? That's exactly what happens in Exodus. Why do the descendants of Abraham and Sarah end up in Egypt? Because of a famine. Joseph goes ahead of them. There's a famine. They end up down there. They're there for a while. Problems with Pharaoh, right? So what does God do to Pharaoh? Sends plagues. And then before they leave, what do the Egyptians give to the Israelites? All the stuff, right? All the loot. So that when the Israelites leave, their pockets are stuffed with the riches of Egypt. And then they depart. What do we see happening here? Genesis 12 is the prototype for what happens to the later Israelites. Because of the famine, the people of God end up in Egypt. There's problems with Pharaoh. God plagues Pharaoh's house. Israelites leave laden with the riches of Egypt. So what happened with Abraham and Sarah was the pattern of the prototype that will be followed by the people of Israel. Now, this kind of patterning, where one thing is predictive of another thing, which itself is predictive of another thing, that we find throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Let me just kind of, since we're on this, let me just take this trajectory a little bit further. You have the first Exodus, we might say, in Genesis 12, Abraham and Sarah. You have the second Exodus in the book named Exodus, where the entire people of God are brought out. Now, when Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Ezekiel, all the other prophets are looking forward with their prophetic eyes to what is to come, this great redemption which is on the horizon, you know the way they describe this redemption, this great act that God is going to do when King Messiah comes? They describe it as a Exodus. Why? Because there's a predictable pattern about the way that God likes to work. He exodused Abraham and Sarah. He exodused his people from Egypt. And they'll say things like, a greater exodus is coming, where God is going to gather his people not just from Egypt. Oh, that's too small a thing. He's going to gather them from north and south and east and west. And everybody's going to come home. In other words, the prophets, get this, the prophets are interpreting the Bible. They're reading Genesis, they're reading Exodus, and on the basis of these texts, these stories, they are preaching what is to come. So that the hope of the future is built upon the deeds of the past. What God did in the past provides the assurance of what God is going to do in the future. Now, since we're on this, let's just take it one step further. Why not? Go into the New Testament. First of all, Jesus has to have his own Exodus when he's a baby, or at least 2 years old. Herod wants to kill him, and so he goes into Egypt. He's got to retrace the footsteps of his fathers. So he goes into Egypt, and then out of Egypt I called my son, Hosea says, and so he comes out of Egypt. He does his own Exodus because he's come to redo the doings of his people. He's come to go through his own Exodus. That's why he's tempted for 40 days in the wilderness, because they were in the wilderness for 40 years. That's why when he quotes the word of God to the devil's temptations, he always quotes from Deuteronomy, that section that's all about the Israelites in the wilderness. He's redoing what his people messed up. And then finally, in Luke's version of the Transfiguration, not Matthew and Mark, but in Luke's version, you have Jesus, of course, his disciples, and then he's talking with Moses and Elijah, right? Moses and Elijah. Now, I have no idea. I'd like to sit down with Matthew and Mark and say, why did you do this to us? You wrote these Gospels and you said Jesus is talking to Moses and Elijah, and you didn't tell us what they were talking about. Who does that? It's not nice, Matthew, Mark. I mean, it's such a tease. Yeah, Jesus, he had this great conversation with Moses and Elijah. And they don't tell us anything about what the conversation was about. But Luke does. Luke says they were talking about his exodus. His exodus, that's what the word is in Greek, which he was to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now, Moses knew a thing or two about the exodus, which God accomplished in Egypt. And Elijah had his exodus of sorts. He ran away from Jezebel, and he was at Mount Sinai there for a while. So he left, and he came back too. But Jesus, he's got another exodus. He's going to go into a place, he's going to an exile that Moses and Elijah were never in. He's going to go all the way into the exile of death itself. He's going to go all the way into that far, far off country of the grave. And there he's going to remain for 3 days and 3 nights. And then God is going to bring his son home again from exile. He's going to repatriate him from the grave by the resurrection of the body. So Jesus does accomplish his exodus there in Jerusalem. And when he does, it's not just one man who comes out of the grave. For if in Adam all die, in Christ all shall be made alive. This is the resurrection of humanity. The reason that every single one of us can stare at the grave and laugh and mock is because that grave has been defeated long ago in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The reason we can look at the grave of our loved one and say, "You shall rise again," is because Christ stepped out of that grave. The resurrection is a return from exile. The resurrection is the great exodus. It's the coming out of that place of darkness and death into light and life again. And so it all comes full circle. Abraham and Sarah, Genesis 12, Israel in the book of Exodus, the prophets talk about this, Luke talks about it, Jesus accomplishes it. That's the Exodus theme traced from Genesis all the way through the New Testament. And that's just one little taste of what is there. So let's talk about some other examples. I mean, that's kind of that's a big cross-testamental example. I want you to think about Genesis. I always go back to Genesis because it's the first place, right? It's the foundational book. Why not go back there? So let's think about how this patterned way of God doing things is exemplified, for instance, in Adam and Noah. Okay? So you know about Adam. You know about Noah. But I want you to think about the cross between these two. All right? To do that, I want us to look at a couple verses. So open up to Genesis 5. This is the genealogy. Also, you could also call Genesis 5 the litany of death, because you'll have so-and-so lived so many years, he had a kid, he lived a few more years, and he died. And he died. And he died. So it's like Genesis 5 is putting an exclamation point on Genesis 3. The wages of sin is Genesis 5. And he died. And he died. Except for one guy. I mean, there was a guy that made it, right? Enoch walked with God, and he was no more because God took him. So there is one exception to that. But I don't want to look at Enoch. I want to look at Noah. So if you go to Genesis 5, verse 28, we'll read about his dad, whose name was Lamech, however you want to say that. And he lived 182 years, and he became the father of a son. Now he called his name, now this is where we need to, again, slow down, read closely. Read small. You know, say aim small, miss small, or read small and miss small here too. He gave him the name Noah, saying, "This one shall give us rest." Noah's name is a pun off of the Hebrew word for rest. This one shall give us rest from our work and from the toil of our hands, arising from the ground which the Lord has cursed. Now hold your finger in Genesis 5 and turn back a couple pages to Genesis 3. Verse 17. And, I mean, I wish we could all be looking at this in the Hebrew because it'd be easier. But we'll have to suffice with the English here. 3 of the words that are used in Genesis 5, toil, ground, and cursed, also occur in Genesis 3:17. 3:17. Cursed is the ground because of you, God's talking to Adam. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Now let these two verses echo in your head at the same time. God's talking to Adam. He just messed up big time. He just messed up all of our lives. Thank you, Adam and Eve. Appreciate that. So in toil you shall eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Cursed. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. You got cursed, ground, toil. All traced back here to God's speech to Adam. Now fast forward several generations. Now there's something you can't see in this genealogy. But if you were to sit down with pencil and paper and start adding up, okay, do your little graph. Adam lived this long, okay, and this guy lived this long, and this guy lived this long, blah, blah, blah. And you get down to the birth of Noah, the son of Lamech. Guess who died right before Noah was born? Adam. Noah's is the first recorded birth after the death of Adam, when you do the math. Which leads me to believe maybe this is why Lamech thought that. Adam is dead. Now my son is born. This son is going to be the one who's going to give us rest from the ground and the toil and the cursing. So this could be too far, but I'll go ahead and say it. I think that Lamech was convinced that Noah was the one promised in Genesis 3:15. So God promised in Genesis 3:15 he's going to crush the head of the serpent. He's going to provide, rest and victory and release and all these great things. And Lamech thought, now's the time. Noah's going to be the kid. Well, how would he know, right? God didn't specify who it was going to be. It's just going to be the seed of a woman. It was real wide promise, It wasn't like he said, she's going to look like this or from this family line. It's just a woman's going to give birth to a boy, and he's going to do this. So evidently Lamech thought this was who it was going to be. Well, he was wrong, but he also had, he was on to something here. Because, pick up the story. What does God do with Noah? Well, of course, God brings Noah and his sons and their wives, 8 people in all, into the ark. And we have the animals. And then we have the unleashing of the waters. Now, what's happening in the flood is this. All creation is rewound to Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, where you have water everywhere. So the flood is a repeat of Genesis 1, verse 2, before dry land appeared. What has God done? He's done a hard reset of creation. I'm going to bring everything back to the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. There you go. That's the Noah story right there. He's reducing everything back to a watery chaos, where the only floating life there was in the ark. And who was in the ark? Well, you had this one that at least his dad thought was going to give us rest from the ground, which was cursed, and the toil and all this stuff coming from Adam. What you have in the ark is a floating Garden of Eden. Here you have Adam and Eve represented in the persons of Noah and his wife and their sons and their wives. This is the core of a new humanity. And the animal population as well. Well, after everything dries up and they come out and they step forth, they step into a cleansed world, a new world. This is now Genesis 2. We have this new family surrounded by animals stepping forth into a new creation. Now, you got to be careful here because the Bible will trick you. The Bible will sometimes make you, as you're reading along, the Bible will kind of lead you to think, oh, finally, we're going to have resolution. Everything's going to be great after this because look at this guy, look at what God did through him. And then you keep reading, you're like, oh, I guess not. Because Noah gets drunk, passes out naked in his tent. His youngest son sees him. You have a curse pronounced after that. So the story kind of leads you to think, this is going to be the guy. And then you're like, it's not the guy. You have this repeated. You think Abraham's going to be the guy. No, he's not the guy. Solomon, you get to Solomon, you're like, come on, this is the guy. He's the son of David. He builds the temple. He's like wise beyond wisdom. I mean, there is no IQ like Solomon's IQ. And then you keep reading the story, you're like, oh, I guess not. 1,000 wives and concubines, building worship sites for all the women. Oh, Solomon. But so the Bible does that. It kind of leads you to think, this is the guy, not the guy. This is the guy, not the guy. But all the guys also serve a bigger purpose. They point beyond themselves. They're bigger stories than their own story because they point ahead to what is to come. Adam points to Noah. So Noah is like Adam number 2, we might say, Adam 2.0. But that's not enough. You need a last Adam. You need someone who's finally going to come and be the guy. Someone who is going to provide rest from the ground and from the toil and from the curse. What's the Christmas hymn? Far as the curse is found, far as the curse is found. He comes to accomplish things as far as the curse is found. And it's not Adam, it's not Noah, it's finally only the man of rest himself, Christ, who does that for us. But you can see here how when you read the story of Adam, alongside the story of Adam 2.0, these two figures are signposts pointing down the road to what is to come, to who is to come. And it's interesting, too, how Jesus will compare his days to the days of Noah in the Gospels. As it was in the days of Noah, so will be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. Or, actually, the precedent for that was already set by Isaiah. If you turn to Isaiah 54, so right after that big chapter, Isaiah 53 with the crucifixion, Isaiah 54 already talks about the days of the Messiah are going to be like the days of Noah. So already in the Old Testament, you have the days of Noah being a figure, a prefigurement for what the days of the Son of Man are going to be like. So you have a Adam, a Noah, a Jesus connection. Now, let's look at one of my favorite ones. We kind of got to go New Testament, Old Testament on this, and that is the figure of Melchizedek. So Genesis 14 is where we meet him. This is a bigger deal than we think when we initially read it. Okay, there's a lot of biblical characters that you'll come across, and you'll be like, I don't even remember this person. Or someone will make reference to someone. I guarantee you before years ago, remember that book, The Prayer of Jabez? Remember that book? Back in the 90s? How many of you know nothing about The Prayer of Jabez? Oh, that's good. That's good. I won't get into it. Anyway, so years ago, I'll just give you the short version. Years ago, there was a book called The Prayer of Jabez, which was about a guy named Jabez, who's mentioned in Chronicles in like 2 verses. And the book was probably one of the biggest religious sellers of all time. I guarantee you before that book came out, if you'd have polled churches around the world and asked how many people even had heard of the name Jabez, it'd be like 1%. He's just like barely mentioned, right? Because he's never mentioned again. And there's people all over the Bible like that. You know, they play a small part, you know. I'm not saying they're not important, but they're a very small part. A little bit of mention about them, and then they're gone. Melchizedek was almost that guy. He was almost that minor character who stepped onto the biblical scene, waved, stepped out, that's it. You know, most of us wouldn't even know his name unless a big deal was made about him later. Let's just read Genesis 14, 18 through 20. Oh, let me set the context. So Lot made a poor real estate investment. He's like, Sodom looks like a pretty cool place, to live. What stays in Sodom, what happens in Sodom, is supposed to stay in Sodom. Didn't work out that way. But he says, it's really cool there. I love it. It's pretty. I'm gonna live there. So, location, location, location. He had never heard that little bit of that truism from real estate. Settles there, And then, as often happened in the ancient world, some big kings come in, they make the little kings pay tribute. The little kings do it for a few years. They get tired of that. They rebel. The big kings come in, beat them up. That happened. And the big kings who came in beat up the little kings who were in Sodom and Gomorrah and some other cities. And it's always happened in the ancient world. How do you get rich if you're beating up on other kingdoms? One of the ways you get rich, not just by loot, you take people. And what do you do with the people after you take them? You sell them. I mean, this is the way it was worldwide. This is how Caesar got rich. This is how a lot of people in the ancient world got rich. If you're a warrior, you capture a bunch of people, you sell them into slavery. You pocket the cash. That's what they were going to do here. So they take Lot and his family. And Abraham hears about this. He goes and he rescues Lot and everybody else in this great nighttime attack. And he's headed back, all right? So Abraham is a successful warrior. He's headed back with Lot and all the POWs from Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, let's pick it up here with verse 18. Now Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was a priest of God Most High. In Hebrew, El Elyon. And he blessed him, that is, Melchizedek blessed Abraham, and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he, that is Abraham, gave him, that is Melchizedek, a tithe, a tenth of all. And just like that, he's gone. Disappears from the narrative. The next guy we meet is the king of Sodom. So Melchizedek, he's got a kind of interesting name. It means king of righteousness. He's king of some place called Salem. He brings out bread and wine. He blesses. He gets a tithe. That's it. If that's all we knew about Melchizedek, he'd be a curiosity, for biblical trivia or something like that. But he's not. There's more going on here than meets the eye. So first of all, this is the first priest we meet in the Bible. I like to note these things which are a first in the Scriptures. The first priest we meet is Melchizedek. And as if that's not enough, he's also the first priest we meet who's also who's also a king. He's a priest and a king. And he's in this place called Salem. And for him to bless the patriarch and for Abraham to give a tithe to him indicates that he must be somebody of some importance. Well, what kind of importance? Well, many, many centuries later, his importance had a huge spotlight focused on it. Because a king named David, who reigned in a place called Jerusalem, which is an elongated name for Salem, where Melchizedek had been, one day said, I'm going to write a psalm. And he sat down and he wrote a real short psalm, which begins, The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. It's Psalm 110, which you can turn to now. In Psalm 110, here's a bit of biblical trivia for you. Psalm 110 is the most quoted Old Testament chapter in the New Testament. By far. In fact, Psalm 110 verse 1 is the most quoted Old Testament verse in the New Testament. I just quoted it to you. The Lord, Yahweh, said to my Lord, Adonai, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. But it doesn't stop there. We have to keep reading. So we have this situation already set up in verse 1 where you have the Lord talking to the Lord. Two different words in Hebrew. But the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand. That's quite an invitation. You get to sit at the right hand of God Most High? Who is this Lord he's talking to? Well, let's read on. What's going to happen? Verse 2. The Lord will stretch forth your strong scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of your enemies. So this Lord, who's going to sit at the Lord's right hand, is going to be a ruler from Zion. Zion, keep in mind. Zion, another name for Zion is Jerusalem or Salem. So already we're thinking, oh, okay, we know this place. Verse 3, your people will volunteer freely in the day of your power, in holy array from the womb of the dawn. Your youth are to you as the dew. We're just going to set that aside. There's all kind of crazy things in the Hebrew going on there. I want you to focus on verse 4. The Lord has sworn, that's Yahweh, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. Now, we would expect what is about to happen next is him to say something like, you are a king forever, and I will establish your throne everlastingly, or something like that. That's what you would expect. I mean, this is all regal language, right? Sit at my right hand, rule in the midst of your enemies, from Zion. This is all kingly language. And all of a sudden, David throws a real wrench in things by saying, you're a priest forever, according to the order of, drum roll, Melchizedek. I guarantee you the first time this psalm was sung, people were like, what? What is going on here? Melchizedek. We haven't heard about him since, let's see, Genesis 14. That's an Abraham story. Priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And then we go on to talk about more conquest of the enemies. God's at your right hand. He's going to shatter kings. He's going to judge among the nations. So a lot of victory language. So this whole psalm has a military feel to it, a regal feel to it, and then smack dab in the middle, a priestly feel to it as well. So obviously, this guy I talked about in verse 1, who is the Lord, sitting at the right hand of the Lord, is a king, that's for sure. But he's also a priest. And he's not just a king and a priest, but he's a king and a priest who's patterned after not Aaron. He's not from the tribe of Levi. In fact, get this, he's from outside Israel. This isn't like cousin to Abraham or somebody. This is somebody who is not connected to Abraham genealogically. He's a Gentile. Melchizedek is a Gentile. There's no bloodline connection to Abraham whatsoever. He's a Gentile king and a Gentile priest, and this Gentile king and priest is going to be the pattern for the priesthood of the Lord, who's the king, and a priest who sits at the right hand of the Father. Shocking. This is remarkable. This changes everything. Because now we know this has got to be the Messiah. I mean, there is no way around this. In fact, we know that first century Jews all knew this was the Messiah being talked about. Remember the conversation Jesus had with the Pharisees? Jesus sets them up. He's like, who is the Messiah David's son? And like, yeah, of course, everybody knows he's the son of David. And he says, well, then why? Anytime Jesus begins with, well, then why? You're like, oh, man, what's coming? He's got us. Well, then why, in Psalm 110, I'm just paraphrasing, does David call him Lord? Oh, interesting twist, huh? And none of them replied, well, Psalm 110 isn't messianic. They all knew Psalm 110 was about the Messiah. They all accepted this. Who else could it be about? It's got to be about him. So here we have the Messiah called Lord. He's at the right hand of Yahweh, and he's a king and a priest in the order of Melchizedek. Now, if you turn to the book of Hebrews, especially chapter 7, this is kind of where it meets its culmination, preaching. So Hebrews chapter 7. It's actually not just in chapter 7, but this is where he kind of pulls all the Melchizedek stuff together. He says, for this Melchizedek that he's been kind of hinting at through the course of the sermon, this Melchizedek, king of Salem, all right, we already knew that about him, priest to God Most High, who met Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. So far, all this we know. To whom also Abraham apportioned a 10th part of all the spoils, was first of all, by the translation of his name, King of Righteousness. So Melchizedek is a combination of the Hebrew words for king and then for righteousness, or for righteous. And then he's also king of Salem, and Salem is connected with Shalom, so he's also king of peace. So he's doing a little bit of etymology preaching here. But then he gets to verse 3. He's still talking about Melchizedek. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like, notice those two words, made like the Son of God, he abides a priest perpetually. Now, we don't have time to get into all of those details. In my book, that's one of the most mysterious verses in the entire New Testament. I did my master's thesis on Melchizedek, so I spent a lot of time looking into this, and it still remains one of the most mysterious verses that's there. But I don't want to get off into the weeds on that. What I want you to focus in on, though, is that last little bit. He's made like the Son of God, resembles the Son of God. Is some way patterned after, connected, whatever you want to translate that. So there's a connection between Melchizedek and Jesus. Well, yeah. All the author of Hebrews is doing is preaching on the Old Testament. He's preaching on Genesis 14. He's preaching on Psalm 110. And he's pulling it all together. He's saying, yeah, the Melchizedek certainly resembles the Son of God. You want to know why? Because everything about him is shouting the Messiah. He's a king of Salem, king of peace. Who do you think Jesus is? That's exactly who he is. He's a priest. Yeah, who do you think Jesus is? He's a great high priest. And he's not in the line of Levi. I tell you that. He's not one more Aaronic priest, because as we'll go on to talk about in the rest of the chapter, those Aaronic priests, thank God for them, but those guys did not have it going on. They were sinners. They had to offer sacrifices for their own sins. And you know where every one of them ended up? In the grave, dead. They work for a while, they die. They sacrifice for the sins of the people, for their own sins. These guys can't provide perfection. You got to have something different. You got to have something better. That's exactly what you have in the priest after the order of Melchizedek, who has the power of an indestructible life because of his resurrection, who doesn't offer the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, but offers his own blood, who doesn't year by year enter into the holy place, thereby signifying that it's imperfect, because you got to keep doing it over again. Everybody knows if you keep doing something over again, evidently it wasn't perfect the first time. So Jesus, once for all, with his own blood, enters into the holy place, thereby offering a perfect and an everlasting redemption, because he's the perfect priest, who happens to be also the perfect king, who now reigns from the heavenly Jerusalem. And he's not just the priest for the Jews, because he's not from the line of Aaron. He's from a totally different line, the line of Melchizedek, which was not from the tribe of Levi, not even from the family of Abraham. So he's the priest of the entire world, Jews and Gentiles alike. So when you trace this from Genesis through Psalm 110 to the book of Hebrews, all of a sudden you realize that this guy, who seems like a very minor character on the biblical stage in the book of Genesis, is huge. Not because of himself, but because of how God was using him as a pattern or a prototype for who the Messiah is going to be. So that's Melchizedek. More we could talk about him, but let's kind of leave that aside for now, because I want to also talk about something connected to Melchizedek, and that's David. So I was thinking about this morning. I got up early. I was on the treadmill because I was not going to walk outside because you people have cold weather here. I usually walk outside. I was not going to set foot outside. So I was walking on the treadmill, and I was thinking about today, and I began to think about David. And I was thinking, it's really cool how David kind of brings together so many different things that precede him, which he kind of embodies. Just think about it. How many times has God selected someone with a less than perfect past? Right? Over and over, right? Well, read the book of Ruth sometime. Where was Ruth from? Moab. You know what Moab means? Remember in Moab what it means? God, terrible. From dad. You know why she named her son from dad? Because that's where he came from. Just teaching the Bible to you, folks. Don't shoot the messenger. If you turn to the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his 2 daughters escape. Mom looks back, becomes a pillar of salt. You go to the cave, and we won't go into the details, but you know what happens. Well, one of the things that happens is Moab is conceived. Ruth's from Moab. Ruth becomes the in the line of David, great-grandmother of David. That's Moab. So David has, when you trace his genealogy, there's some stuff in there that's kind of twisted. He fits that mold. He's also not the likely choice. Now, we see already, oh my goodness, in Genesis 4 with Cain and Abel, but you see this with Jacob and Esau, you see this with Abraham, with Isaac and Ishmael. You see this with Moses and Aaron. Over and over, God doesn't choose the firstborn, right? He switches things up. He's at least choosing the secondborn. Now you get to David, and David again fits his pattern. In fact, he's not the secondborn, or third, or fourth, or fifth, or sixth, or seventh. He's the last one. In fact, I always crack up when I read that story. Samuel goes to Bethlehem to anoint whoever the new king is going to be. And all these sons of Jesse are paraded before him. And then got 7. He's like, that's it? It's like Jesse's like, oh, yeah, there's one more. Forgot about him. What's his name? It's almost like his oversight. Yeah, David, he's the youngest. He's out taking care of the sheep. Well, bring him. And he's the guy. The 8th born. The youngest. He fits that bill. He also fits the bill of one. So I like to talk about the gospel of head crushing in the Old Testament. Because God will use a death blow to the head to kill the enemy of God. You have this talked about in the book of Numbers, where it's actually the source of this idea, the Star of Jacob. Well, he's going to crush the forehead of the enemy there. This goes back to Genesis 3:15. You shall bruise his heel, he shall crush your head. So it begins there. That's the gospel of head crushing. You're going to take out the enemy. Enemy number 1, you're going to take him out by crushing his head. Genesis 3:15, you have that in Numbers. You have Abimelech, who's a bad dude in the book of Judges. A woman kills him by throwing down a stone, hits him in the head. Now, what does David do? He goes out to Goliath, takes his sling, bam, stone right in the middle of the forehead. Takes out enemy number 1 with a blow to the head. So David fits that mold as well. He's a persecuted one because Saul persecutes him. He has to go into exile because of that persecution. Eventually, he's brought back and he's king. All of these features of David fit into the pattern that we've come to expect of what God is going to do. They kind of coalesce in this one person. And that's why David becomes, in many ways, the capital T type of the Messiah in the Old Testament. He is a king. He is the 8th born. He's from a backwater town. He's got a pedigree that's less than stellar. He's got all of this going for him from a God perspective. HR wouldn't hire him. But God, no HR would ever hire God because he always hires the wrong people. Why would you want him? God just trust me, right? I know what I'm doing. And so we knew what he was doing in getting David. So what happens in David's life? Well, something really amazing happens because at one point David's like, you know what? I got a nice house. God's living in a tent. I want to make a house for God. And the prophet at first is like, go for it. Sounds good. And that night, God says to the prophet, no. Go back and tell David, no. I got a better idea. You want to build me a house? Listen, I've been moving around in the tent for generations. I don't need a house. But I tell you what, let me build you a house, God says. This is 2 Samuel chapter 7. Except he's not going to build David like a castle. He's going to build him a dynasty. He says, I'm going to raise up one of your seed after you. He's going to build a house for my name. And I'm going to establish the throne of his kingdom forever. This promise in 2 Samuel 7, we see kind of in a shadowy way, not fulfilled isn't the right word, but in a shadowy way kind of displayed, acted out, we might say, in Solomon, who is the son of David, who does build a house, the temple for God. But the throne of his kingdom doesn't last forever. He dies, as do all David's grandsons and great-grandsons after him. The promise remains. The promise remains until finally, one day, in a place called Nazareth, there's a teenage girl who's betrothed to a guy named Joseph, and an archangel shows up and says, I've got some news for you. And part of that news is that this child that's going to be conceived in her by the power of the Holy Spirit will sit on the throne of his father, David. So Jesus comes as that son of David promised back in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And we see this throughout the Gospels, right? What do people call Jesus? The son of David. They know. They know who he is. And so this David patterning becomes so prominent that he is the only one in the entire Old Testament, David, the only one in the entire Old Testament, whose name actually becomes, what do you want to call it? A nickname, we might say, an alternate name for the Messiah himself. Let me just give you a couple examples. We won't look at the entire context, but just so you know what I'm talking about. So if you go to Jeremiah 30. Jeremiah 30, verse 9 says, they shall serve the Lord their God, and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. Now this is Jeremiah talking. This is a long time. David's been in the grave for a long time at this point. This is the 6th century. David was in the 900s. This isn't like the historical David is going to raise up for him. He's talking about the coming king, whom he names David. Turn to Ezekiel chapter 34. This is the shepherd imagery that shows up in the Gospel of John. But part of this is this. Ezekiel 34, let me read you 23 and following. Ezekiel 34, 23 and following. Then I will set over them, this is God talking, then I will set over them one shepherd, my servant David. And he will feed them. He will feed them himself and be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. And we can look at other examples too. Hosea uses the same kind of language. The Messiah is so closely connected with the person of David that he's named David in the Old Testament. So if you were to stop a first century Jew on the streets of Jerusalem and say, hey, I'm conducting a survey, just wondering, when you think about the Tanakh, all the stories, is there anyone in there that you think would most closely resemble the Messiah? Without a moment's hesitation, that person would say, David. Obviously. Everyone knew the Messiah was going to be like David. Because David, everything coalesced in him. He was the king. He was the one who set the pattern. And the promise was given to him. In fact, an interesting thing happens. So I mentioned earlier that when the promise was first given in Genesis 3:15, it was just a woman, seed of a woman, right? No specification given. So it's very broad. Genesis 12, you find out, it's going to be from the family of Abraham. That's a narrowing significantly, right? And then you go on, it's going to be from Isaac, okay, not Ishmael. It's going to be from Jacob, not Esau. It's going to be from Judah, not any of the other tribes. And then you get to 2 Samuel 7, and it's narrowed even more. Not just the tribe of Judah, but the family of David. He's the tip of the spear. Everything begins broad, and it narrows down, until finally, the Messiah is going to be of the line of David. And it never narrows any further after that. That's the closest we get. So we know from 2 Samuel onward, the Messiah is going to be in the line of David. Seed of a woman in David's line. So for all those reasons, when you read about David in the Old Testament, always ask yourself, we'll talk more about this in Bible class in the morning when we talk about the Psalms, but always ask yourself, okay, what's God doing through David that establishes the archetype or the prototype or the pattern, choose your word, for what the Messiah is going to do and who he's going to be. Because what you'll see in David's life multiple times is God using him in these very specific ways to pattern what God is finally going to bring to fulfillment in the Messiah. I mean, we see this, just one more detail. We see this most clearly on Palm Sunday. Jesus is riding into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, and what are the crowd shouting? Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Here's the King, fulfilling prophecy by riding in on a donkey, because he is the Son of David who comes to establish his throne there in the city of David. There's so much more we could touch on. I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking, okay, I got 5 minutes. I got like 5 hours of material here. What do I want to talk about? Let's see. Oh, you know what? Let me finish with this because I can do this real quick. So if you have your Bibles, just open up to Romans 8 and Genesis 22. Romans 8 and Genesis 2. We'll start with Romans. I just want to point you to one verse. And then Genesis 22. And then we'll go to lunch after this. So Genesis 22 is the story of what the Jews call the Akedah, which is the near sacrifice of the binding of Isaac, the near sacrifice of Isaac. All right, so let's turn back to Romans 8, and let me read to you Romans 8:32. You know this section well. We've heard this multiple times in churches and Bible classes. Let me begin with verse 31. Romans 8:31. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who is against us? He who did not do what? Spare his own Son, but delivered him up for us all. How will he not also with him freely give us all things? So God did not spare his Son. In Greek, that word is thedomai. Okay? He didn't spare his Son, thedomai. Now, just kind of keep that in your mind and turn back to Genesis. Genesis chapter 22, verse 12. We'll begin at verse 11. So Abraham's got the knife. Isaac, the promised son of Abraham, the seed of Abraham, is stretched out on the altar, bound. Abraham's got the knife in his hand, raised to plunge into his son. Verse 11. But the messenger of the Lord, oh, here's our friend again. How fitting is this? Who stops the sacrifice? But the one who will be the sacrifice. Goodness gracious. But the messenger of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. What a relief. And he said, here I am. And he said, don't stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not. Now in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, they chose to use the word thedomai here. You have not spared, withheld your son, your only son, from me. I like to talk sometimes about how the New Testament authors don't give us footnotes. They don't Paul didn't put a footnote after he wrote thedomai, and you look at the bottom of the page and say, refer to Genesis chapter 22. He expects us to know. He expects us to know the Old Testament. He expects us to know the language and the stories. He expects us a lot from us readers. He's not going to spoon feed us this stuff. And so when Paul writes in Romans 8 that God did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, he expects us to hear an echo there of Genesis 22, where Jesus, the messenger, says to Abraham, don't stretch out your hand, because now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld your son, not spared your son, the only son, from me. And in that way, when you read Romans 8 with Genesis 22, you realize, oh, so this narrative here also of Abraham and Isaac is painting before us in black and white what will appear in full color in the ministry of Jesus. When he who stopped the knife to spare this son of Abraham, himself would go under the knife, under the nails and the spear, not be spared, in order that he might deliver us all, so that we too might have the faith of Abraham, and thus be called the sons and daughters of Abraham, because we have a faith like his own. So in Genesis 22, the Son of God stops the sacrifice, which he himself will become, and which Paul will rejoice in Romans 8, and which we continue to rejoice in today. So Genesis 22 becomes a picture of the cross of Jesus before our eyes. Picture of the good news that is ours in Christ. Now I'm going to stop there. Let me make one announcement before we head to lunch. So I don't know I haven't seen the schedule printed out, but lunch is going to begin now. And then what we'll do, two things. If you want me to sign your books, I'm going to be at the table with my lovely wife. So if you want an autograph, I'll be there. After you eat, just come in there. And then at 12:45, I'll be back in here. I think the schedule says 1, but we're going to bump it up a little bit. 12:45, I'll be in here for Q&A. So we'll do about 15 minutes of Q&A from 12:45 to 1-ish. And then I'll give my last presentation. Then I'll save a few minutes at the end for any more questions that you have about the Gospel of Leviticus or anything else that might come up. Deal? Okay. Pastor?
Yes. All right. So let me give you some lunchtime instructions. We're going to be eating in what we call Luther Hall, which is just a big auditorium. And what you're going to do when you head out the doors, the back of the sanctuary, take a right and just keep going. And you will run into Luther Hall, and you'll see tables and stuff that are set off there off to the left. So just head in there. There's going to be one table kind of on the far side of the hall, and it's going to have all the food laid out on it. And what you can do is you can go down on both sides of the tables. We actually want 2 lines that'll get us through as quickly as possible. There's plenty of seating. You will notice going in that there is a free will basket. That is a free will basket, not a bait and switch basket. So we told you we'd feed you, and really and truly lunch is our gift to you. People have actually asked us, is there some way that we can help, some way